Under the soft morning sun of an April day in Vermont, in a small apartment on the edge of town, the neighbors began to whisper. Frank Ellis, the quiet janitor who had worked at the local elementary school for over 40 years, had passed away silently. No ambulance sirens, no grand funeral, just a small obituary tucked into the back of the town newspaper. Walter Briggs, 82, passed peacefully. Everyone thought he was just a simple janitor. Every morning, he walked to school in his old gray coat and worn black shoes. He always smiled, nodded politely, and never complained about anything. His life was so quiet that no one noticed. He had been hiding the biggest secret the town had ever known. A few weeks later, when his lawyer read the will, the entire community was stunned. Frank Ellis had left behind over $8.7 million. A number so shocking, people couldn't believe it. How could a man like him, no fancy car, no smartphone, living in a worn-out rental apartment, possibly accumulate such a fortune? Have you ever wondered how a humble janitor lived like a secret millionaire and why he never changed his lifestyle? In this video, I'll tell you the real story behind that man. A journey of humility, patience, and the quiet power of financial choices that changed everything. You might think someone like Frank Ellis could never become wealthy. But after hearing this story, you just might think again. Frank Ellis wasn't the kind of person you'd stop and notice on the street. Every morning, he left his small second-floor apartment in an old beige building on the outskirts of Vermont. The wood creaked in the hallway, and on rainy days, the scent of damp oak lingered in the air. Frank always wore a light blue button-up shirt, khaki pants with frayed hems, and a pair of brown leather shoes he polished every night. His only transportation was a silver bicycle, slightly rusted, with a bell that chimed softly, a sound neighbors came to recognize as Frank's quiet hello. He worked as a janitor at a local high school. Nobody knew much about him, except that he always showed up early, stayed late, and never missed a shift. He wiped every smudge from the floors, cleaned classrooms with precision, and polished glass doors until they shone. In the mornings, you could hear the steady swish of his mop, the soft steps of his worn shoes, and sometimes the faint hum of old jazz tunes under his breath. Every day, he brought the same lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a small thermos of black tea. The scent of warm tea and nutty bread somehow became part of his presence, a quiet comfort. No one at the school knew that Frank had once been a history major in college. He loved old stories and simple wisdom. But after losing both his parents, Frank had to drop out and work. From then on, he chose a quiet life. What puzzled many was how he seemed content with so little. In truth, he was meticulous with his money. He carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket, where he tracked every expense in neat blue ink. Frank never spent needlessly. If something still worked, he kept using it. His 30-square-meter apartment had warm yellow light from an old desk lamp, making the small space feel cozy at night. One day, a student asked, "Why do you live so simply?" Frank smiled, eyes lined with time but shining with peace. "Because true happiness doesn't come from having more," he said. "It comes from needing less." But there was something almost no one knew. Every Friday afternoon, Frank visited the public library. He didn't just read books on personal finance. He took notes, studied charts, and read investment reports. He lived like an ordinary man, but learned and invested like a quiet strategist. His frugal living wasn't just about saving. It was about building, slowly, silently, over 50 years. And this was only the beginning. Because in the next part, you'll discover what no one expected. Frank didn't just live simply. He quietly built a multi-million-dollar fortune. And how he did it might just change how you see money and maybe even how you live your life. The reason no one knew Frank Ellis was wealthy was actually very simple. He never lived like a rich man. No luxury cars parked outside, no fancy watches or the latest phone. Frank still used an old flip phone, the kind you'd see in movies from the early 2000s. The soft click when he closed it sounded like a gentle sigh, a simple ending to each short conversation. He didn't show off. He didn't share. Not a single post on social media. When people at school talked about investments, real estate, or stocks, Frank just smiled and kept mopping, as if those conversations belonged to a different world, one that had nothing to do with the mop in his hand. One winter, a coworker offered him a ride home during a heavy snowfall. Frank declined, saying he liked the quiet of riding his bike. "The sound of snow hitting my helmet reminds me of memories knocking softly," he said. It was the only time he ever shared something personal. Then he went quiet again, like he'd never spoken. No one suspected a thing, because he lived exactly as he appeared: a modest rental apartment, simple clothes, frugal habits. Everything about him painted the picture of someone just getting by. But behind that silence was something unusual. Frank never borrowed money. He always paid his bills, on time, and sometimes people saw him reading investment books at the library. But no one thought much of it. The truth? Frank was a quiet student of wealth. He had been tracking stocks since the 1970s, investing in index funds long before most people even knew what they were. He didn't gamble. He believed in consistency, contributing every month, buying more when the market dipped, and letting time do the rest. His wealth didn't come from a lucky break or a secret deal. It came from principles and patience, living below his means, investing steadily. Two simple things that most people struggle to do for a lifetime. And because he never changed his lifestyle, never talked about money, never gave off any signs of being rich, no one had a reason to question it. To everyone else, Frank was just a kind, hardworking man. Nothing more. But the lesson here isn't hide your money to get rich. It's this: you don't have to show wealth to be wealthy. Some people, like Frank, choose humility, not because they're poor, but because they value peace over flash, substance over appearance. And the most surprising part? It's still to come. Because next, you'll find out who Frank left his fortune to, and why that decision moved an entire town and changed it forever. A quiet heart that started a ripple he would never live to see. Frank Ellis may have been a quiet janitor, but for nearly 5 decades, he was also a hidden financial strategist. And no one ever knew. His financial secret didn't come from an investment firm or an expensive course. It came from simple things most people overlook: old notebooks, steady habits, and a life philosophy that went against the grain of consumer culture. Since 1974, Frank had been tracking every monthly expense by hand. A small brown leather notebook, its edges worn from time. Every dollar was recorded in blue ink. Lunch, 15 cents. Bike maintenance, $9. Library, free books. Even spare change was noted carefully. It wasn't stinginess, it was how Frank listened to his money. He knew exactly where every penny went. He lived in a faded beige apartment with small windows that always let the sunlight in. No air conditioning, just an old standing fan humming through the hot summers. The tiny kitchen always smelled of morning coffee and crisp toast. Frank never ordered takeout. He cooked simple meals, warm, satisfying. And the most remarkable thing, even with a modest salary, Frank invested at least 30% of his income every month. Not in hot stocks, not in crypto, not in tips from friends. He chose index funds, stable, low-cost investments that young people often ignore because they don't make you rich fast. For nearly 50 years, he invested every single month, rain or shine. When others panicked during the dot-com bubble, Frank bought more. When the market crashed in 2008, he didn't pull out. Frank didn't invest with emotion. He invested with discipline and a deep understanding of time. Because he knew one powerful truth: compound interest is the most loyal friend of the frugal. One day, a young teacher asked if he had any advice. Frank just smiled and handed her a thin book with a yellow cover, The Millionaire Next Door. Then he said softly, "It's not how much you make, it's how much you keep." The lesson from Frank's life is simple. You don't need a huge income to build real wealth. You just need to start early, live below your means, and stick to a simple plan. Like planting a tree, you don't need to flood it every day. Just water it consistently, and let time and sunlight do the rest. But even that isn't the most amazing part, because the $8.7 million Frank saved wasn't for himself. In the next chapter, you'll discover exactly what he did with it, and why that one decision brought an entire town to tears. Frank Ellis passed away on a March morning, quietly, just like he lived. No headlines. No family at the funeral. Just a few close neighbors, a couple of former co-workers, and the high school principal from Lincoln High, where Frank had worked as a janitor for over 30 years. White chrysanthemums sat on a small table, their soft scent drifting gently through the air, like the morning mist that used to settle over the schoolyard when Frank was still alive. No one knew that behind his passing was something that would leave the entire community speechless. Just 1 week later, letters from the bank and the law office changed everything. Frank had left behind $8.7 million, dollars, a number no one could have imagined, especially from a man who wore old shirts and rode a chipped gray bicycle. But what brought people to tears wasn't the number, it was where the money went. Frank left nearly his entire estate to Lincoln High School, the place where he had quietly walked the halls, unlocked doors each morning, and cleaned up after glittering prom nights. A large portion of the gift went into creating the Quiet Dreamers Fund, a scholarship for students who had no voice, the quiet ones. Often overlooked, but always trying their best. The shy kids who studied hard. The ones without much, but who never asked for anything. Kids just like Frank once was. The news spread fast. Local TV came to interview the principal. Students made tribute videos. A portrait of Frank was hung in the new library built with his fund. In the painting, he stood under the old oak tree in the schoolyard, sunlight slipping through the branches, his face calm, with a kind smile. At the memorial, a senior student, the first to receive the scholarship, spoke through tears. Mr. Frank never said much, but now he's spoken louder than anyone, through his heart. The town began to reflect. People who once believed that wealth must be shown off went quiet. Young families who'd gone into debt just to keep up started talking about frugal living. Spending with purpose. A new personal finance class opened at the high school, named The Ellis Way. No fancy textbooks, just lessons from a real life. Spend less than you earn. Invest consistently. Live humbly. Frank's impact wasn't about how much money he had, but how he lived, and how he chose to give. The takeaway from this chapter might be as simple as this. Sometimes, the people who change a generation aren't the loudest voices, but the quiet ones who plant seeds day after day. But there's still one final thing, something very few people knew about Frank. A letter. It was found tucked inside an old wooden drawer, and when it was read, it made everyone pause with a lump in their throat. And that letter is what will close this video. A message that might just change the way you see life and what true wealth really means. Frank Ellis lived a simple life, not because he had no other choice, but because he chose it. But if that's the case, why is it that most of us, living in a modern world with more information, tools, and often higher incomes, can't seem to live like Frank? Because in reality, to live frugally, with intention and purpose, requires more than financial knowledge. It takes inner strength, discipline, contentment, and the courage to go against the current. Frank wasn't pressured by social media. He didn't need to post photos of his house, his car, or vacations. But for many of us, each day is a silent comparison, with former classmates who've made it, with coworkers showing off new cars, or with strangers flashing their wallets on TikTok. That constant comparison quietly pulls us into the spending spiral, not because we truly want more, but because we're afraid of falling behind. Last year, a survey in the US found that nearly 65% of adults couldn't save even $500 for an emergency. Not because they didn't earn enough, but because money was constantly leaking away on a new iPhone, a fancy dinner, a few swipes of the credit card after a long day. And the sad truth? Those small emotional expenses often add up to years of financial struggle. Frank spent over 40 years not living by what others called normal, but by what he believed in. He lived by principles. He could have bought a car, but he chose to bike. Not because he was poor, but because he wanted to stay healthy and save for something bigger. He could have rented a better apartment, but stayed in the small room behind the church. He could have traveled, dined out, but preferred walking in the park, eating homemade sandwiches, and reading under the warm glow of an old lamp. Those simple choices built a quiet wealth few would ever suspect. So why can't we do the same? Because many people don't have a clear long-term goal. They don't know what they're saving for. Frank did. He didn't just save, he invested. And he didn't invest for himself. He invested for the next generation. When you live for something bigger than yourself, you're not so easily swayed by flash sales or flashy distractions. The lesson here is this. True wealth doesn't come from your salary. It comes from how you value every dollar. And more importantly, you don't have to be just like Frank. But you do need to find your version of Frank, a version of yourself that lives by what you truly believe, not by pressure, not by judgment. And that brings us to what's next, a look into Frank's quiet investment strategy. How did a man with just a mop and a bucket build wealth like a seasoned investor? The answer lies in old, faded bank statements and a lifetime of simple, powerful choices. When people think of wealth, they often picture big houses, fancy cars, Maldives vacations, or candlelit dinners at upscale restaurants. But not Frank Ellis. To him, wealth meant freedom, not the freedom to buy more, but the freedom to need less. His way of living simply to become rich wasn't about restriction. It came from a deep life philosophy. Happiness doesn't come from what you have, but from how you see what you already have. Frank started his mornings not with Starbucks, but with a cup of black tea brewed at home, sometimes paired with a slice of toast and cheap peanut butter. He didn't wear suits or polished leather shoes, just beige khakis, a wrinkled button-up shirt, and canvas shoes worn at the heels. But he was always clean, always tidy, a kind of quiet dignity that came from within, not from display. The scent around him was always the same: ivory soap and a soft hint of pine wood from his small, warm, perfectly neat apartment. So quiet at night, you could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the dark. Minimalism, for Frank, didn't mean going without. It meant choosing with intention, keeping his mind free from the clutter of things that didn't matter. He once told a close neighbor, "I don't need much, because I've learned what enough feels like." That sentence, simple as it may sound, is the heart of lasting wealth. When you know what's enough, you stop chasing money out of fear, and that's when money starts to stay with you. A study from Harvard once found that people who live simply tend to feel less stress, are more satisfied with life, and save 3 times more than emotional spenders. Not because they earn more, but because they have better control. Frank was living proof. He never taught anyone how to invest. No blog, no book. But his life, every decision, every habit, was a living case study in financial freedom. Quietly, he practiced the philosophy of pay yourself first. He invested at least 30% of his income, even when his paycheck was barely enough. Over 40 years, Frank bought shares in companies he believed in: Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola. He didn't chase trends. He didn't trade on hype. He simply invested in value and stayed the course. The lesson here isn't that you must deprive yourself or starve your joy. It's this: spend on what truly matters to you. Stay aware of short-term wants and let your dollars work for you so you don't have to work yourself to the bone for them. And in the end, when Frank passed, he didn't just leave behind $8.7 million. He left behind a quiet question that stirred everyone who had ever known him. If a janitor who lived simply all his life could become this wealthy, what's holding the rest of us back? And maybe the answer lies in the final part of this story, where you'll discover not just the fortune Frank left behind, but the legacy of values he's still planting in others today. Frank Ellis lived a quiet life, like a still lake in the early morning. No ripples, no noise. But when he passed, the ripples of his story spread far and wide, touching the hearts of thousands. Some called him the richest janitor in the world. But the true wealth Frank left behind wasn't the $8.7 million. It was the quiet, powerful question he left us with. Do we really need that much to live a meaningful life? Frank wasn't extraordinary. He didn't win the lottery. He didn't launch a tech startup. He didn't invest in crypto. He simply lived below his means, invested consistently in value stocks, and never let noise overpower his peace. That consistency, that clarity in a world full of temptation, is what's truly admirable. And it makes us ask ourselves, if a janitor, without a fancy degree or a high salary, could quietly build $1 million legacy, what's stopping the rest of us? Maybe it's emotional spending. Maybe it's the fear that we've started too late. Or maybe we've just never been taught how to make money work for us. But Frank's story proves one thing: it's never too late to start living differently. It begins with one small decision: cutting a needless expense, learning how to invest, or simply sitting down to ask yourself, what does enough mean to me? If you've ever felt like you're falling behind in the race for financial freedom, remember this: Frank didn't run. He walked steadily, quietly, and by the end of his life, he reached a place many spend their whole lives chasing, but never find. And if you're wondering, Where do I even begin? The next video on this channel will hand you a map, a new story, more relatable, more real, and maybe it's a story that sounds a little like your own. So come along for the journey, because maybe you're just one small habit a day away from the life you've always wanted.